Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and it's such a pleasure to get to host these and to introduce so many of you to some of the talks that have just been amazing and inspirational and challenging as we engage topics and issues that are not always easy to talk about, but that are so essential for a Christian who wants to engage our world today. And the topic we're dealing with today is one that's very personal to me, and it's also something culturally that many of us are going to have to consider in the days ahead. And it's this topic of euthanasia, and what does it mean to care for people at the end of life? You see, as boomers continue to get older, it's a question that will continue to come up. And we have states across our country now who've actually signed into law, and many who are considering policies that would allow people who've just been given 6 months to live to have the opportunity to die if that's what they choose. And so many times in the life discussion, we talk about the beginning of life, we talk about termination of pregnancies and abortion, but not often have we talked about what does this mean to see these kinds of ethics play out in a culture that doesn't necessarily respect life and is maybe interested in saving money because it's certainly much cheaper to give somebody 2 pills for $50 that could actually end their life than actually sustain life over time. Well, how do Christians think about this? In this Q Talk today, you're going to hear a very personal perspective from Kimberly Kuo. And Kimberly Kuo is married to David Kuo. David was a good friend of mine, and to some of you who are listeners, he's somebody who was actually given this 6-month diagnosis. And when he was given that, he had a choice about how he was going to respond. And Kimberly's going to share with you in a very personal way through tears what the story was like, how this played out in their life, how they considered what life was about, and what does it mean for a Christian to actually experience suffering when you're not sure you have the answers and when it's so tough to try to walk through this as a family. David was a father. He was a writer. He's somebody who served in the White House. He's somebody that lived an extraordinary life. But you're going to get to hear from his widow, Kimberly, as she describes the agonizing choices that were before them and how they walked forward in faithfulness. Let's listen.
My story starts in September of 1999 when I married this guy. I know I could have picked a much more flattering photo, but this really tells who David is. He loved the Steelers, he loved Star Wars, he loved poo, and he loved theology. Most of all, he loved Jesus. He loved his friends. He loved serving the poor, and he was very full of life. We lived in Washington, D.C. when we got married. And about 3 years later, David was working in the White House. He was in the West Wing. He was writing on Air Force One. We were deeply involved in a startup church. We hosted church in our home twice a month. And I was the head of communications at a big trade association in Washington, D.C., and we were just truly, truly blessed. Then one night, we were driving home around midnight from a snazzy Washington, D.C. party with Bill Bennett and Bo Derek and all these cool people. And I was kind of falling asleep in the passenger side, and David said, "Kim, there's something wrong with my leg." And when I looked over at David, his eyes were rolled back in his head, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel, and his leg was on the accelerator, and I could feel the car racing underneath us. And he was seizing, and I had no idea what was going on. So I tried to move his leg. I couldn't. I shoved the car into neutral, and by that time we were going about 90 miles an hour in the oncoming lane of traffic. And so I saw a patch of grass over on the right, and I just aimed at this car and pulled as hard as I could, and we went flying over an on-ramp and landed on the other side. David ended up in the emergency room of GW Hospital that night, Palm Sunday morning. And after a number of tests, they were wheeling him through the lobby area of ER, and I was sitting there waiting. And he does this. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. But what it meant was that God was yanking us out of that matrix, and he was going to draw us closer to him. At about 4 a.m., on Palm Sunday morning, David was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and given 6 months to live. Now, the good news is we actually ended up fighting a 10-year battle against brain cancer with more ups and downs and miracles and disappointments than you could possibly imagine. So this is not a theoretical question for me. Our path was never easy, but I promise you, it always drew us closer and deeper into the Lord for strength and wisdom and just to get through the day. And although we were very involved in our church, I will tell you, our faith changed immediately. All the keychain Bible verses are out the window. Soaring on wings like eagles, and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, did not cut it. We had to wrestle to the ground every single day. I think of Chris Tomlin. You're a good, good father. You're perfect in all of your ways. We had to wrestle that question to the ground. And in the deep of the night, we breathed Psalm 91. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but it's a battle psalm. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. Pestilence will not take me by night. 1,000 will fall at your side, but I won't be one of them. We wanted to fight, and we believed that God was going to fight with us. Every seriously ill person travels along a continuum. At first, you're mostly the same person. You have some symptoms. And as time goes along, you get more and more of the disease and less of the person. Ultimately, as the loss increased over our life and over those 10 years, we became Psalm 13 people. This is a psalm of David being crushed. But in the end, he says, I trust in your unfailing love. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. The tenor of submission changes, but the character and holiness of God in the Psalms never changes. God is above all, and he deserves to be exalted, no matter what we are going through down here. And I have to tell you, I never thought the assisted suicide debate would be a part of our story. But a year after David's death, I see this. Brittany Maynard was a young girl in California in her 20s who was given the same diagnosis that David did. She had 6 months to live from a terminal brain tumor. Her response was to set the date for her suicide. And she was called a hero. She was named CNN's one of most 11 influential people of the year. Shortly after her death, 20 newspapers across the country started advocating for assisted suicide in their states. And last year, since then, the national support for assisted suicide has raised 20 points. NPR and the Washington Post have announced this is the next liberal cause. Liberals feel like they've won the abortion debate, won the gay marriage debate, and now they want assisted suicide policies across the country. Honestly, the first thing that caught my attention about this debate was the spin that this is dying with dignity. And the 10 years we've spent fighting then, apparently, was not. And this is the compassionate choice, right? But to me, half the people in this room were compassionate to us, flying across the country, sitting with us in ICUs and rehab centers, and eventually hospice. That is compassion. I was also shocked to find that 70% of Americans support assisted suicide, largely based on the fact that that's the compassionate choice. They're buying into this. Surely it's the kinder, more godly thing to do, right? To end someone's suffering. Well, I'll tell you, when I started looking into this, the first really good example of promoting assisted suicide I found was Job's wife. Definitely not a Proverbs 31 woman. I think this is interesting for two reasons, though. First of all, by this time, Job had already lost all his herds, all his cattle, all his children. But there's something about attacking our physical selves, right? She comes to him and says, okay, now God's attacked your body. Curse God and die, right? Thankfully, he said, you're acting like a fool, which is advice to us, right? Don't act like a fool. Don't take the good from God and not the bad. The second thing is that neither Job nor his wife had any idea that their story would live on like this, that we would all be reading about it, learning from it so much later. Now, David and I's reach was not that great, granted, but we did realize early on that our story was not just about us. It's true, our hearts were radically changed, but so were so many who walked along with us, and that was part of our purpose. I'm often asked if I think assisted suicide is an unforgivable sin. And the answer is no, I don't. I do believe, however, it's the original sin. It's the shift from seeking God and wanting to be transformed and follow God to wanting to be God, refusing to surrender to the assignment that God has given you and demanding control for yourself. And I will confess to you, there were many times I hated the assignment God gave us. I hated David's suffering, and I hated that it took over our life. I remember sobbing and crying on the phone with my friend Martha. I was sitting in the lobby of the UCLA Medical Center for another brain surgery. And all these co-eds were going in and out with lattes and lip gloss, and I'm just saying, I hate my life. How did I end up here? Why me? And my dear friend Martha calmed me down, and she said, even Jesus in Gethsemane prayed, God, please spare me from this suffering and this separation. But in the end, he said, no matter what, I will honor you with this assignment. There was purpose in his suffering, and there's purpose in ours. So before you buy the spin of what Pope Francis has actually called misdirected compassion, consider how our story played out. The California law that just passed, that goes into effect this summer, is for anyone who has 6 months to live, and that's considered a very stiff safeguard for assisted suicide. Well, for early on, we learned that we were ill-equipped to play God, and so were our doctors. David was given that diagnosis, 6 months to live, 3 times over the course of 10 years. 2 years after that first diagnosis, our daughter Olivia was born. And 4 years after that, our son, Aiden, was born. Here is our family picture 9 years after David got his first diagnosis of 6 months to live. And by the way, advocates like Stephen Hawking, committed to euthanasia and atheism, was given a year or 2 to live when he was 21. He's 74. Jack Kevorkian, of course, Dr. Death, who initiated the euthanasia or assisted suicide laws in the U.S., was given 6 months to live and died 5 years later. So to me, it's lunacy to write policy based on the unknown. So I spent 15 years in Washington. I have to say a couple of things just from a policy perspective here. David and I both worked in government for over 15 years, and I know a lot about policy. And I will tell you 2 things I know. Number 1, policy is shaped and driven by money, and it always grows. So when the government endorses assisted suicide as a policy, somebody has to decide who dies. Let's look at money. Already in Oregon, insurance companies have started refusing to pay for a number of cancer treatments. But in every case, they'll pay for the $50 for the patient to take lethal drugs. In California, the same committee that proposed and passed the law for assisted suicide is tasked with closing a $60 million gap for Medicare and Medicaid, which is healthcare for the poor and the elderly. It is always cheaper to kill a patient than to treat them. So it is really, really cheaper to kill off a poor person than to treat them. So oddly enough, religion isn't the determining factor of who supports assisted suicide. The people who are afraid of it are the minorities, the disabled, the poor, the people who know they are first on the list should this become law. Those are also the people who are most likely to be pressured toward your burden on your family. Just take the pills. It's cheaper. You won't be a burden on your family. My second point about the policy issue is Europe is several years ahead of us on this debate. And if you look at Europe, it's not a slippery slope. It's a runaway train. So much so that the bioethicist who helped write the laws in Europe recently testified in Britain, don't do this. He said, we were naive and suicide rates are spiraling out of control. It's creating a suicide demand. So you can see how it's expanded. They all started with 6 months to live. Now it includes things like Asperger's and dementia. There are headlines, especially in Switzerland, where there's suicide tourism. People fly in if they're old and they just don't feel pretty. There was a lady who said she'd lost her beauty. A 27-year-old woman who'd broken up with her boyfriend. 3 separate doctors agreed to give her lethal drugs, and 6 months later, she was dead because the kind of depression from a breakup. So you can see where this expands. And if you don't think that can happen in America, take a look at how it's expanded in Oregon, which was the first state to pass assisted suicide. In the 2 years since Brittany Maynard was arguing for assisted suicide, it's increased 81%. And again, in Oregon, that's where insurance companies have stopped covering a lot of terminal treatments. Well, not even terminal, but just cancer treatments. Another tough question I'll throw out to you. What if you're wrong? Our doctors were wrong. They never knew when David was actually going to die. You're not wasting tax dollars. You're not wasting natural resources. Talk about Earth Day. You're killing people if you're wrong. I'll leave you with 3 truths that we found during our 10 years of fighting cancer. First and most important is God, from the beginning of time, has numbered your days. He has planned them out. He's given you gifts and talents, and every one of those days matter. In the last 2 weeks before his death, Dave was talking to his neuro-oncologist, and he was telling her about his heart for the poor, and he was challenging her, how do poor people get cancer treatment like this? As a result, after his death, she started a ministry to homeless cancer patients. Just before David went into hospice, he was witnessing to his atheist resident who came into the ICU to talk to him. He was challenging him to read Mere Christianity. And in the last 11 days of his life, David was in hospice, which, by the way, was the least amount of suffering for him. He had chemo and radiation and a lot worse things go on. But scores of our friends visited him there. We read Psalms, we sang hymns, we laughed, we told stories. We were all changed. And every day after preschool, my son Aiden would come over, just lay down by David. He was unconscious, he was incoherent, but Aiden would throw his arm around him and just smile. He wanted to be with his daddy. Because every one of those moments mattered. They mattered to my son, and I'm sure they mattered to David. And those were not my moments to take away. Second, I realized that suffering is a fearful thing. Nobody wants to do it, but everybody probably will. But it's not the worst thing you can endure. David endured more pain and loss than I ever thought possible. He had 5 brain surgeries, he had radiation, he had chemotherapy, he had bleeding on his brain, he had blood clots in his lungs. But he fought for his life, and he fought for his family, and he never wavered in his belief in a holy and a perfect God who knew what he was doing. Worse than any suffering is to believe that God no longer has a purpose for you. Your life no longer has meaning. Brittany Maynard said that she refused to endure purposeless suffering and die a terrible death. I would say that a purposeless life is more terrible. And I saw purpose in every one of David's days. So if God gives us every breath like the Bible says he does, then he has a purpose for every breath. It might benefit you, it might benefit someone else, and it might just glorify him. Some say that a diagnosis of brain cancer is the worst thing you could get. And I used to think that. I used to agree with that. But now I would say that giving up on God is worse. And imagining that God would give up on you is worse. God doesn't make mistakes, and it's not up to you to fix it.
This is Gabe Lyons with Q, and I want to invite you to continue this conversation in person by being a part of Q Commons taking place on Thursday evening, October 13th, in communities throughout America. On this particular evening, we're bringing together key voices to help you know how to engage our divided nation. We're going to have Dr. Ravi Zacharias talking about our divided moment and what does faithfulness look like in the middle of that. We're going to also have Grammy Award-winning artist Lecrae talking about race in America. And finally, Kirsten Powers and Ross Douthat, two political commentators, talking about the upcoming presidential election and how should Christians think about voting. It's sure to be an evening that's going to help you think well about what it means to bring hope and leadership to your communities at a time where divisiveness is ruling the day. So join us by learning more at qcommons.com. Find the city near you, and if you don't see one in your community, host it at your church. You can learn more at qcommons.com/private simulcast.
So I'll just end by saying, you know what? We're not God. We learned that over and over. We can't draw boundaries and limits around God. And our reward is in heaven. Our reward is not happiness or even comfort here on earth. There are a lot of things about our story I don't understand. There is a lot of disappointment and loss. But David and I always believed this, that as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. We always knew that God had a purpose for us and for everyone who journeyed with us to the very end. So as this assisted suicide debate rages on, I would challenge you to really think about this verse. Your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. You are not your own. You were bought with a price. That price is paid in full. If you want a model of true compassion, I would follow the example of Mother Teresa, whom David loved. She spent her life among the sick and the dying, and as far as I know, she never recommended or offered them lethal drugs to end their suffering. Her view of life sums up how I believe David lived his. Life is an opportunity, benefit from it. Life is a dream, realize it. Life is a challenge, meet it. Life is a duty, complete it. Life is a promise, fulfill it. Life is sorrow, overcome it. Life is a struggle, accept it. Life is a tragedy, confront it. Life is an adventure, dare it. Life is precious, do not destroy it. Life is life, fight for it. Thank you.
Quite emotional just listening back to Kimberly deliver this talk, and obviously so incredibly heart-wrenching and personal, and yet you hear the conviction. You hear the conviction that she understands how Christians are to think about life, how we probably do think differently than the broader culture might think about that, but how the way in which we as Christians think about life has something to offer to the rest of the world, especially in the midst of their suffering. I hope you'll share this with a friend. Think about those around you who might be experiencing suffering. It may not be in the form of brain cancer, but it may be in the form of them going through something that they don't quite understand why this is happening to them. And certainly the easy answer might be to escape the pain, to run from it. And yet we see in Kimberly's story in the life of David that in running towards that pain and surrendering to it, how much we can learn from our Heavenly Father about how much He loves us.